North Spore was excited to take part in the 43rd annual Telluride Mushroom Festival in Colorado in August of 2023. Among the many mycological luminaries present was Alan Rockefeller, a photographer and expert in DNA sequencing and microscopy. We sat down for an interview to reflect on his 20 years collecting, documenting, and studying fungi predominantly found in North America. If you're not familiar with Alan, he is highly regarded within the mycological community for his significant contributions to the classification and taxonomy of fungi. It has been suggested that over 1 million species of fungi exist, with a very small fraction of them properly identified, named, and recognized by science. With over 25,000 observations on iNaturalist, Alan's portfolio covers fungi, some plants, animals, and nearly 6,000 categorized species, including wild psilocybin-containing fungi. Beyond his remarkable dedication to meticulously documenting everything he finds, he is an incredible educator and person who has deepened our understanding of fungi in our ecosystems.
Hi, and thanks for talking with us. Who are you and what do you do?
I'm Alan Rockefeller, and I study mushrooms.
Well, that's a very interesting answer, Alan. Could you tell us a little bit about, in what way do you study mushrooms? Are you a chef?
I mean, I'll cook just for fun, but mostly I do photography, DNA barcoding, and microscopy. Mm-hmm. So I really like mushroom identification, taxonomy, and documenting all the mushrooms, especially cool rare species or unusual species, or even trying to get the best picture I possibly can of something that's common.
Fantastic. That is really something. So what got you into this in the first place?
I think it was like Christmas Day 2001. And I was walking through the woods and there was mushrooms everywhere. And I was like, wow, these, there's gotta be, some of these gotta be poisonous, some of them probably hallucinogenic, some of them probably edible. There's gotta be people out there that know what these are, but I didn't know who those people were or how to get a hold of them. So I just started taking a closer look at them. And I've always been pretty into nature and doing a lot of hiking. But, at this point I was kind of like working in tech, and I was kind of struggling to justify all the time I was spending in nature, because sure, it's good exercise, but what am I really doing with my life out there? So I started paying closer attention to the mushrooms, and after a while it was kind of like, well, instead of just wasting my time walking down these trails, I have a goal. I'm trying to learn these mushrooms, trying to get the best picture I possibly can of all the mushrooms, and then I felt like I was making really good use of my time in the woods, which made me feel a lot more okay about spending so much of my time in the woods.
Hey, that's beautiful. I think I speak for everyone at this Telluride Mushroom Festival. Everybody loves to spend time in the woods, and so you've found a great way to justify it. And over the years, you've made really significant contributions to the field of mycology. Can you talk a little bit about some of the discoveries you've made?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of make discoveries every day whenever you're out in the woods. Once you learn which ones are cool and which ones are rare, which ones have names and which ones you don't, you might discover 30 or 50 new species in an afternoon. And that might seem like a lot, because for a botanist, if they discover 2 or 3 new species of plants in their life, that's a good botanist. But with mushrooms, they're way less documented, and we just don't have names for a lot of them. And I don't feel like I really have to go around scribbling my name all over taxonomy, so I'm not naming everything I possibly can. But sometimes things catch my eye, and I may or may not name them if somebody else doesn't. I don't really care. But what I do like to do is try to get the best picture I possibly can of it, and then release that picture into the public domain so anybody can use that picture for anything, forever. And then get a good DNA sequence that goes along with that collection that I photographed. Put the DNA sequence into GenBank so it's publicly accessible forever. And then I put the pictures on Mushroom Observer and iNaturalist and Wikipedia. So these are citizen science mycology sites where Other people can comment and identify the mushrooms, and then the DNA sequence links back to my photos. And then for Wikipedia, when the general public wants like a good picture of the species and they can be confident that it's correctly identified, then they're like, okay, this picture has a DNA sequence with it, so I'm going to use this picture. So just kind of combining all that together. I really like to combine the DNA sequence with quality microscopy. So you put that all together and you get a really in-depth like picture of what this organism is, and then the next time you see it, you just feel like so much more of a connection to it. It's like seeing an old friend, and that's really cool, and it's like, seems like a really good use of my time to get as many DNA sequences in the GenBank as I can.
So I want to touch on the photography in a second and ask you more about that, but there is a particular genus that you've done a lot of work on that has a lot of meaning for people, and that's psilocybe. Can you talk a little bit more about your work with psilocybe in particular?
Yeah, everybody loves psilocybe because they're very mysterious, they're hallucinogenic, and they have a lot of medicinal benefit. But it's also understudied, especially in the modern sense with DNA sequencing. There's a lot of psilocybes out there that we just don't know much about. A lot of the species, described 100 years ago, and there's no photos of them, or the only photo that exists is like black and white. So it's really fun to try to go out to these places where it was maybe seen 60 years ago and see if I can get a good modern photo of it, get some DNA sequences in the GenBank, verify that it is what I think it is with some high quality microscopy. And psilocybe is really cool to study for a lot of reasons. One reason is because people just love psilocybe. So when I post something about psilocybe, it gets a lot of attention. And that's really cool. It really draws a lot of people into mycology. So like my main goal with this is to get people more engaged with nature. And one of the best ways to get people engaged with nature is with psilocybe, because they can eat them and it has this really profound effect. But also, they have to go way out into these crazy habitats to find them. And so it really gets people out there. And then once they're out there, they're looking at all the mushrooms, paying really close attention to all the mushrooms. So usually, a lot of people, especially the younger people, they start out looking for psilocybe. And once they find them, by the time they find them, they're already hooked on all mushrooms, and they start getting really into Russula and Sapphirella and just all of them, because they start to notice the differences between everything, and they realize that like a lot of the stuff they're seeing in their travels are really rare or understudied. And it just kind of like opens this whole Pandora's box. And so many people have told me that I've really changed their life. And some people, they'll like say like they were kind of on a bad path, maybe like experimenting or like really addicted to hard drugs, or even like kind of into crime, like like theft and all that sort of criminal stuff. And then they started spending a lot of time in nature, and it kind of like drew them away from all of that. And now like they just like their whole life is just about spending a lot of time in the woods, camping out, photography, that kind of stuff. And it's so much more fulfilling than a life where you're like trying to get high all the time or take things from people or anything like that. It just seems like it's really good for your soul to be out in nature a lot. And I think that's encoded into our DNA. Everything humans do is encoded into our DNA, good and bad. But being out in nature, kind of like it brings out the good side of humanity.
Bravo to that. So if you've got some nice samples, tell us a little bit about how you approach taking good photographs.
So I've been taking photographs since, 2003 or something like that. And all of my work before 2010 is completely unusable. Like when I'm teaching people how to take good photographs, sometimes I'll search for my early photographs so I can show them what not to do. And so I learned to take good pictures just by taking a lot of really bad pictures. About 2010, I started to get an idea what's going on. So some of the pictures from around then started to be good. 2011, way better. But I didn't start focus stacking until 2020. And these days, like I really, when I need a picture of something, I always look for something that's within the past couple of years, because my photos didn't start to turn out the way I really wanted them to turn out until I started focus stacking. So focus stacking is where you combine a whole bunch of pictures into one final image, and it really bends the laws of physics in several different ways. But another really cool thing about it is that it makes it really easy for people who are not experts at photography to take amazing pictures. So like before focus stacking, I had to like teach people to get like the ISO just right and the aperture just right and all this stuff. Whereas with focus stacking, it's a lot more like you set the camera down, you press the button, and then you bring all the images back, put them together in the computer, and even if it's like the first image you've ever focus stacked, it's going to look amazing. And the reason it looks amazing is because the aperture is all the way open, the ISO is all the way down. And of course, it's really important to find good mushrooms to photograph, high quality specimens that are not dried out, ideally in several stages of development. But even if it's just a single mushroom and you're just like shooting like up against the sky, if it's focus stacked and if it's lit right, it'll look amazing.
I've been that person too that sent a picture in to an expert and it was just like a blurry cap. That's how I began too. So what are some things that people should think about when they're sending in pictures? What does a mycologist need to see to identify a mushroom?
One of the things I specialize in is identifying mushrooms from bad pictures. And so a lot of times somebody will post a really bad picture and everyone else will reply like, oh, you got to get a picture of the underside. We're going to have to see this in focus. What's the spore print color? And I'll look at the picture and I'll look at like where in the world it is. I'll try to look at the leaves in the background and I'll be like, I think I know what this is. So I'll say, oh, compare this with chlorophyllum molybdites. And even though it's just like a blurry streak, just based on the time of year and the location, more often than not, it's right. But to actually communicate like through photos what a mushroom is, it's important to get a picture that's in situ. So that means like before you pick it, take a picture of it. And then the second most important thing is the underside. And when you get the underside, you don't want to like cut it off. You want to like kind of pop the mushroom out from below, ideally. If you just grab the stem, you'll usually leave this big fingerprint on it. So I like to have a few different specimens and a few different stages of development, kind of all in one frame. So that ideally you'll find like a cluster of mushrooms, and then there'll be some other mushrooms kind of scattered around, and I'll take those other mushrooms and lay them down in front of the cluster. That way you can see in one image all of the different stages of development, how it looks when it just starts out, how it looks when it's like almost rotten, everything in between. And just being able to see the underside, especially of the underside of a mature mushroom, is one of the most important things. The reason for that is because the gill color of a mature mushroom will match the spore print color unless it's white spored. So by being able to look at a bunch of different mushrooms and then just see how the gills change color as the spores mature, that gives you a lot of insight into what it actually is.
Awesome. So besides pictures, you mentioned DNA analysis. Now, when you sequence these mushrooms, what do you do? What does that entail?
It's actually pretty easy. It's more difficult than cooking eggs, but it's easier than baking bread. So what I do is I get the best picture I can, and then I usually throw it on my dashboard for 3 or 4 days until it's completely dry. You can also use like a food dehydrator or maybe just leave it in a window, depending on what it is. But then when I bring it back, then, microscopy is how things used to be identified, but microscopy takes so much time and it takes a lot of experience to get any useful information out of microscopy. In the first few years, you're wrong half the time, and it's great. I mean, it's really beautiful, some of those microscopic structures, but at the same time, DNA sequencing is a much better way to identify mushrooms. And so I've been teaching DNA sequencing classes for probably about 8 years now. And it sounds like it's really advanced, but it's not actually that hard. You just have to get the DNA into solution. There's a bunch of different ways to do that, but it's DNA extraction. I like these really quick DNA extractions, so I just mix up a few chemicals, usually a base like sodium hydroxide and some kind of stabilizers like EDTA and a buffer like tris. But anyway, you just mix up these really cheap and easy to get chemicals, and you take just a little bit of the mushroom, maybe just 1 or 2 milligrams, and put it in a little tube with some of your extraction buffer and heat it up for a few minutes, and then some of the DNA will be in solution. And then you run a chemical reaction called PCR. So PCR is polymerase chain reaction, and what this does is it amplifies a certain gene. So a mushroom has a DNA, The whole genome of the mushroom is like 40 million base pairs long, so it's like a book that's 40 million characters long. What PCR does is it takes just whatever gene you want and it amplifies that, doubles it, copies it billions of times. So you end up with billions of copies of this little gene. And there's certain genes that we use more than others. The most common one is the ITS, or internal transcribe spacer. This gene is awesome because it does absolutely nothing, but is really variable between species. So I take a little bit of this mushroom extract, throw it into a PCR reaction with ITS primers, and a couple hours later it's done. And then I can either run gel electrophoresis to see if that worked, or just skip that step, send it off to a lab that does Sanger sequencing. And so there's like all these labs all over the country, and all they do is Sanger sequencing. So they take DNA from all sorts of laboratories, hospitals, any kind of place that runs PCR. And so you give them like $5 and they will run Sanger sequencing, run it through their equipment. You can run them at home, but it's kind of not recommended because the chemicals are expensive when you're not buying them at scale. And the machines need a lot of maintenance. So what I do is I run PCR, and if I run it in the morning, then I'll fill out the order form at around noon, and then about 3 p.m. this guy will stop by my house and ask for the samples, and I'll take them out of the freezer, hand them to him, and about midnight the results come in. And so it ends up costing me like $5 or $6 per sample, and that's almost free compared to how cool the data that I get back is. And the data that I get, the most important thing that it does is it ties collections together. So if the holotype of a specimen has been sequenced and you have a holotype sequence, if your sequence matches the holotype, then you know exactly what it is. So you're tied together with the holotype. More often, there's no holotype sequence, so it takes a little bit more thinking, but what it will definitely do is tell you that the thing that you found is exactly the same as the thing that somebody else has found. So you can see like where in the map, where does this thing occur? And then you can start thinking about what names people usually apply to this and what part of the world that was described from, and if any of your sequence matches are from that part of the world. If they're not, you've either discovered a new species or it's one of these kind of like forgotten species, and you can untangle that with microscopy and then dig into the literature. But I used to do a lot of microscopy just to try to figure out, discover new species and figure out exactly what I found. And it doesn't really work very well for that because so many closely related species are like the same or very similar microscopically. So what I wanted to do with microscopes, the DNA barcoding does really effectively. And then if the DNA barcoding doesn't give me the answer, then I dig into the microscopy. Thing about microscopes is that it's really time consuming. The way I learned is the wrong way to do it, which is to sit down with the microscope for a couple hours a day for several years. What you should do is just talk to an expert that can just tell you how to do it, or join like the Facebook groups like Fungal Microscopy, something like that. But in any case, if you really want the full picture, then you mix the high quality photo with the DNA barcode and the microscopic information, and then you really understand what you've been finding.
Outstanding. I feel like I learned so much just now, and I will need to ask you many, many questions going forward. What I really want to do is take one of your classes, and you teach other classes, right? You learned so much about photography. Do you teach photography classes, and what do you have coming up?
I have a photography class coming up on Madeline Island at the middle of September, and this is like a week-long intensive class where we're going to take pictures all morning and then post-process them in the afternoons. And that's with Alison Polak. She's an amazing photographer. She loves taking pictures of little things, so she refuses to photograph anything that's larger than a centimeter. And so her photos are just stunning. And a lot of times I'll teach like DNA barcoding classes or microscope classes, but the main one I have coming up is the photography class in Wisconsin.
Awesome. I hope we can have you over to Maine and host a class with you.
Yeah, that'd be really cool.
Fantastic. Tell us a little bit more about how somebody just getting into this can really make a difference and not just and turn this from a hobby into real work that's furthering science.
Yeah, and that's one of the really cool things about mycology is that people that don't have any kind of scientific degree can actually make a really big difference because there's so much to discover, and there's not very many people that are paid to make these discoveries. A lot of the people that are paid to do mycology is kind of focused around things that make money. Whereas like identifying mushrooms and mushroom taxonomy, it's not really focused on making money. So there's not really many people paid to do it, which makes it a really good thing for amateurs to get into. So if you just want to make a big difference in mycology, all you have to do is go out into the woods and collect mushrooms. But instead of just throwing them all into a basket, you take good pictures of them and then carefully document whatever features are there that don't show up in your photograph. That's usually taste, smell, nearby trees, any chemical reactions. And then instead of throwing it into a basket, you throw it into a tackle box or a Tupperware and bring it back. You upload these photos to Mushroom Observer or iNaturalist to create a permanent biodiversity record. And then you dry these mushrooms and ideally probably just send them to somebody that does DNA barcoding. There's a lot of people doing like high throughput DNA barcoding these days. So you can just they just run thousands of samples at a time. So it's like Stephen Russell or Kyle Cannon. You send them to these guys, and then once you get the DNA barcode back, you can really see like how common is it? Does it probably have a name? How much do I really have to do a bunch more research on that? Then your collections, you can give them to an herbarium, so it's kind of like a library for mushrooms, but they save your dried mushrooms forever. And most of the things in the herbarium don't have good photos, and most of them don't have DNA sequences. So if you can have really good photos and attach a DNA sequence to that, then your herbarium collections will be much more valuable than most other things that they have. And very often, after you really dig into the microscopy and the DNA barcode, you realize that it's a new species, or maybe it's more obvious than that, and you'll just see it and you'll be like, yeah, that's a new species. And if you feel like it, you can publish a new species. You don't have to have like any kind of academic credentials to publish a new species. You don't even have to go through peer review anymore. You can just make a collection, document it really well, and go ahead and publish it. And then people will use that name for eternity.
That's amazing. So I hope many more people, take that advice and start to do it.
And that's something we really need done, because most of the mushrooms that we find, very, very large percentage of mushrooms that we find don't have names, and we need names for them because we need to be able to communicate what we found. For example, say you find this mushroom and you analyze it using analytical chemistry, you run it through a mass spec, you find some cool new medicine or some valuable molecule. You need to be able to communicate which mushroom this is. And if it's one of the unnamed species, which is very likely, you can't really communicate that effectively. So we need names for all the mushrooms, also just for conservation. If there's a rare mushroom that doesn't have a name, you can't really say oh, this forest needs to be protected because this thing only occurs there. Whereas if you give something a name and then say, okay, this species only has been found in this one little spot, you probably shouldn't chop this spot down, that actually carries some real weight.
Amazing. So talking a little bit more about sort of chemicals, and we had touched on psilocybe, magic mushrooms. Can you tell me a little bit more about your activism work and how you have, I take it that you feel strongly that maybe this shouldn't be a Schedule 1 drug anymore?
Right. So, really the reason magic mushrooms are illegal is because Nixon really wanted to get the Vietnam War protesters. But the First Amendment stood in the way of that. So by banning magic mushrooms and LSD and putting really harsh restrictions on all the drugs that the Vietnam War protesters were using, he was able to get the Vietnam War protesters and not run afoul of the First Amendment. Well, that worked really well for Nixon, but the Vietnam War is over and these laws are not serving us anymore. A lot of people think that maybe drugs should be controlled by the government, but actually prohibition of drugs is way more harmful than the drugs themselves. So people are going to use drugs, they always have, they always will, but when you make it illegal, that really impacts the purity and quality of the drugs people are getting. And it also gives people criminal records, wastes a lot of police time. There's really no upside to criminalizing any drug, especially drugs like magic mushrooms. So psilocybin is not completely safe, no drug is, but it's a lot safer than most drugs. But really, it's important to end drug prohibition. And I think the more dangerous a drug is, the more important it is to legalize it. A good example of that is heroin. It's pretty dangerous. It's addictive, but because heroin is illegal, there's all of a sudden a huge financial incentive to sell it on every street corner. The schools are full of it, whereas legal drugs, they're hard to get for the school kids. And then people realized, oh, fentanyl can be made much easier than growing poppies in Afghanistan, so they start making all this fentanyl and flooding the market with fentanyl, and now we have over 100,000 people dying in the United States from fentanyl overdoses because it's so incredibly potent. And this is completely unnecessary. If the government would just let people purchase the opiate that they wanted, heroin or morphine in the first place, then there would be no market for fentanyl and we wouldn't have all these overdoses. Most of the problems with opiates have to do with dirty supply, dirty needles, people not knowing how much they're using, and also just having a criminal record for something that doesn't hurt anybody other than themselves. So all drugs should be legalized, but that can be a hard sell for a lot of people because drugs like amphetamine or fentanyl actually are very dangerous. But a much easier sell is something like cannabis or psilocybin. These drugs, it's just about impossible to overdose on psilocybin, and most of the negative reactions resolve within a few hours. So, psilocybin is not completely safe, but if you were to compare the safety of psilocybin and alcohol, there's really no comparison. Alcohol destroys so many lives, causes so many people to do so many really unfortunate things. Whereas psilocybin, it certainly makes people feel different, but they don't really go into this mode where they're just like don't know what they're doing and are gonna do something that's really they're gonna really regret the next day. That's really rare on psilocybin. So it's just so much less toxic than alcohol and so much safer. And when you compare it to alcohol, psilocybin is incredibly safe. But if you were to compare it to another drug like tobacco, psilocybin is just like, this is no comparison, because tobacco kills 400,000 people per year just in the United States alone. And people don't really get a whole lot of benefit out of it. Whereas psilocybin kills 0 people per year in the United States, and they actually get quite a bit of mental health benefit from it. So a lot of these psychiatric drugs like Prozac, the same sort of illnesses that are treated with Prozac or Zoloft can be treated with psilocybin. And these psychiatric drugs are really addictive. So somebody goes on Prozac, they have to be on it for a few weeks to see if it really works for them. By that time, they're kind of addicted, and if they go off, they're going to have a really hard time. And then it doesn't really work for very many people. So psilocybin definitely does not help everybody, but I noticed that psilocybin will help like 80% of people, and then 10% of people does not help or hurt them, and then the other 10%, they're worse off after taking psilocybin. And that's a pretty remarkable percentage because most prescription drugs have much worse side effects from that and don't help nearly as many people.
So, bringing things back to the field, now I'm going to put you on the spot even more. Can you come up with, do you recall a really crazy story or adventure from your mushroom hunts that you care to share?
Oh man, there's so many.
Yeah.
Mushroom hunting is really interesting, and it'll always put you into the craziest situations. But are you referring to the incidents with the police?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have 2 of them. It might take a while to really go over them. I actually gave a talk at MycoFest last weekend, and the projector was just totally invisible, and so my slides couldn't be viewed, so I just went into all about the police and psilocybin. And I can tell you about this stuff if you have time.
Well, if you can summarize it somewhat, we've got, but we have several minutes. I want to hear this story. I'm riveted by it, and I'm sure it's a great story. Yeah, go for it, man. Tell us in whatever detail feels right to you.
That actually can't be summarized. There's a lot of details, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
The first time that I ran into trouble with the police, regarding psilocybin is when I was dumpster diving in 2016. So my friends and I used to do a lot of dumpster diving. We'd go to Trader Joe's, and if you've never dumpster dove for food before, it's actually really fun. And you would think that the food would be like yucky or somehow tainted, and it's really not. It's like you go and you get like $1,000 worth of groceries. The ice cream is still frozen. It's just like they throw away so much food in this country. In any case, we went my friend Jake and I went dumpster diving to Trader Joe's, and went to the dumpster, got like $1,000 worth of food, completely filled up my trunk and my back seat with really good food. And then we left, and on the way back, it was like 2 a.m, so there was a lot of police out looking for drunk drivers, and we got pulled over for doing 31 and a 25. And so my friend Jake was driving, and my friend Jake does not like the police very much. In fact, he has sued the police like 3, 4, 5 times now. And so the police came up, and they like said like, oh, you were going 31 and a 25. By the way, like, what's all this food? And where did it come from? And Jake gave a truthful answer that kind of pissed them off, which was a farm. Yes, of course, the food came from a farm, but we weren't coming from a farm. That much was clear because it was all in the packaging. The barcodes were crossed off with a marker. It was obviously from a dumpster. And so the police started asking more and more questions. And, a lot of times people say that if you get pulled over and you're speaking to the police, you should never say anything to the police, and you should assert your right to remain silent. So that's what we went with. We immediately asserted our right to remain silent, which made the police extremely irate. And so they pulled us out of the car and handcuffed us and decided they're going to do a big investigation about all this food. And so that's what they did. So we got pulled over about 2 a.m. After about 5 a.m, they threw us into the back of the squad car in handcuffs. And a common police tactic, they're just going to record your conversation. And so Jake, says to me, he's like, remember everything that these police say in the exact order they say it, because we're going to sue these. And I'm like, okay, man. Like, I didn't think it was really happening, but, sounds good to me. I can remember this stuff. About 6 a.m, there was like a shift change, and they have to decide if they're just going to turn us loose or if they're going to arrest us. But they were really angry at us. They really wanted to lock us up for something. So they spent hours and hours searching the car, and they found 30 bags of mushrooms in my trunk. And they didn't even ask me anything about the mushrooms. They didn't ask me what kind they were or anything. They're like, well, you're not talking to us, so we got 30 bags of mushrooms. You're going to jail. And we're like... So they arrested us, and they ended up charging us with 4 felonies: possession of psilocybin mushrooms, commercial burglary, conspiracy to commit commercial burglary, and receiving stolen property. So those other 3 charges were for the garbage, and then the mushroom charge for the 30 bags of mushrooms they found. So they threw us in jail, and after 5 days they let us out of jail. And after about 2 months, we got a letter from the prosecutor. And the letter said that they tested all of the mushrooms that they found. They all tested negative for psilocybin, and that all of the charges were being dropped. And so they were like, okay, that's good. But they really, they were just being dicks to us. And the reason they were being dicks to us is because we were being dicks to them. And so we decided that we would sue them. And so we found a lawyer that sues the police. And normally when somebody sues the police, it's because the police like beat you up or something. Our case was really small because the police one thing they did is they sent a drug dog in, and the drug dog lied and said that it smelled drugs, but my car didn't have any drugs in it, so they were definitely lying about that. And they clearly were just arresting us because we asserted our right to remain silent. And so we found a lawyer that was willing to sue them. And so we filed a lawsuit. And before the lawsuit actually goes to court, what happens is that you go through an arbitration process. So you try to work it out outside of court. And so we show up at the federal building at 9 a.m, and there is me, my co-defendant Jake, or I guess, since we're suing, we're not defendants. It's much better to drag the police into court than it is to have the police drag you into court. But friend Jake was there, our lawyer was there, and then there was a lawyer for the police that was there, and a claims adjuster for the police. And then there was the mediator. The mediator was this guy in his 50s. He looked just like Anderson Cooper, really sharp guy, and it was his job to try to resolve this case without it going to court. And so we start out the mediation process in the morning, and the police are saying why they arrested us and how what they did was completely legal, and they were just following the law, just doing their jobs, and that we had absolutely no case, and if this went to court, we would get nothing. And we said, no, you clearly arrested us out of spite. It was obviously just a bunch of garbage we had. It was pretty clear the mushrooms weren't hallucinogenic, and your police, you should know if the mushrooms are hallucinogenic or not. They didn't even look like magic mushrooms. They were like candy caps and bull eats and Ganoderma and turkey tail and stuff like that. Anyways, so the police laid out their case why they thought that we would lose in court, and then we laid out our case why we thought that we would win in court and be able to get damages from them. That went back and forth for a few hours, and the police are like, well, we sent a drug dog out and the drug dog found drugs. And we're like, no, you have dash cam video that's going to clearly show that the drug dog did not find drugs. And the police are like, well, actually, the dash cam video shows the car from the back, but we think the drug dog smelled the drugs when it was in front of your car and just outside of the dash cam video. And we're like, that's ridiculous. And the police are like, well, we will call our expert, and our expert will testify that the drug dog smelled drugs, and then you'll call your expert, and your expert will testify the drug dog didn't smell drugs, and who are they going to believe? And so go back and forth. There's all the little issues regarding the search and the seizure, because of course we didn't consent to a search, but they said that they had probable cause to search us. We didn't agree, but at the end of the day, it was lunch break, and so we went and had lunch, and then we came back, and the second half of the day we try to figure out how much we can settle for. So our lawyer says to the police, they're like, okay, well, we'd like to drop this case and not have to go through a whole court battle, so just give us an offer that's not insulting. And the police, they think about it for a while, they're like, okay, we will pay you $500 if you drop this lawsuit. And we're like, no way. We will drop this lawsuit if you pay us $100,000. And the police are like, that is ridiculous. We will pay you $550 to drop the lawsuit. And we're like, okay, we'll drop it, for $99,000. And we go back and forth like that for like 2 hours. And finally, it's like the end of the day, it's 5 p.m., everybody's going home, and the mediator's like, okay, guys, just make your final offer, and we'll see if we can settle this right here and right now and save us all, the hassle of going to court. And so we're like, okay, final offer, you pay us $13,750, and you tell the police that arrested us that they are dicks. And they are like, oh my God, I have never heard of an offer like this. So they tried to keep from laughing successfully, but they were pretty flabbergasted by this. But that was actually the whole point of the case, is that they were being dicks, and the only reason they arrested us, and the only reason they were dicks to us is because we were dicks to them by asserting our right to remain silent. So that was kind of the whole point of the thing. Anyways, they go back and they make a bunch of phone calls and talk to the people higher up, and 20 minutes later they came back and they're like, okay, we accept. And so, they had never seen a settlement like this, but, the money was nice. I paid for a trip of mushroom hunting to Mexico, but more importantly, we just wanted to convey that these guys were being dicks. And we also wanted to stop them from just arresting people that were clearly not doing anything wrong, and just arresting people just because they could, just to be dicks. And so, they cut us the check, and they went back. They told the cops that they were dicks. The other part was that they had to give my mushrooms back. And so all the samples that they took out of my car, they gave them back. And unfortunately, they were all mixed together, so they weren't quite as good as they were before. But I was able to get good DNA barcodes out of the ones that I could still tell what they were, the polypores and stuff like that. And so I learned what happens when you assert your right to remain silent and you just, just play it that way.
You battled the criminal justice system and you won, dude. And I'm sure changed your life and the way that you kind of view how everything works in this country.
Not really, because like one of my hobbies has always been studying law, and so I kind of like know what all the laws are, and I know when a police officer is violating the law. I won't call them out on it, but I know. And it just kind of confirmed that, like, what I thought was correct. It was really interesting. And it definitely felt good to drag them into court or into mediation and win. And yeah, it was a good experience overall. But it was a long process. The whole thing took about a year.
And the whole thing took a year. Wow. And that just is another little mini lesson there for people that cops don't know their mushrooms.
Cops definitely don't know their mushrooms, except they probably know cubensis. But cubensis is only one of 200 psilocybin-containing species.
Sure.
I think one thing I learned is that suing the police is actually not that difficult, and people should sue the police more often when the police violate their rights. If the police are like doing their job and doing, just protecting and serving and doing what they should be doing, then they're not going to get sued. But so often police are not doing what they should be doing. They're just harassing people, kind of abusing the law. And there's a lot of instances where people can sue the police and they just don't, because they don't realize how easy it is. They don't realize they have that power. They don't realize the main thing people don't realize is that there's a law called USC Section 1983. So Section 1983 is where you sue the police for deprivation of civil rights. And this law is actually a really good law. It keeps the police honest, and it actually kind of specifies that you get like triple damages. So it's actually worth your while to sue the police, especially if the police like beat you up or something. Those are the pretty big cases where people get a lot of money. But even small abuses of power, most police officers don't get sued, and suing a police officer is a big deal. That's really going to change how they do their job and how they see their role in policing. And so I think it's a really good thing.
That's powerful. And something I just want to touch on, you seem to have a remarkable memory. You're a good storyteller. Is that something that you've been told before? Do you have a photographic memory, or are you?
That's a good question, because I do not think I have a good memory. Like, I couldn't tell you what I did yesterday, but I can tell you all the names of the mushrooms. It's a very selective memory.
Okay.
But
yeah, go ahead.
I also tried it the other way. So when I was in Tennessee, I was driving through Tennessee. I had 800 bags of mushrooms in my car, and these were mushrooms that I had found mostly in Mexico. So I had just gotten back from 5 months of mushroom collecting in Mexico. And so I was just hunting mushrooms every day for 5 months and taking really good photographs, saving good collections. And then on the way back, I did like an East Coast tour to teach DNA barcoding. And so I had all these mushrooms with me. And my car looked like a drug car. All the hubcaps had been stolen in Mexico City, and then there was like a trunk leak, so I had taken everything out of the trunk and piled it in the back seat. And so I went to get gas at a Knoxville gas station, and I had like a mushroom t-shirt and California plates, and there were some undercovers that were watching, and they were just looking for people that looked just like me. And I didn't see them at the time, but I got my gas, and then I saw like, okay, there's a place to get breakfast 1 block away. And so I drive that 1 block to get breakfast, but I didn't put my seatbelt on because it was only a block. And all of a sudden there's all these unmarked cars pulling me over for a seatbelt violation. And of course they didn't care about the seatbelt, they really wanted to search me. So, they came right up and they started like, talking about the seatbelt violation, but they're like, oh, by the way, we're calling the drug dog. They didn't like ask me a lot of tough questions. They were actually extremely polite. People are in the South, they're really polite, but they're just doing their jobs. And they're like, well, we're going to call the drug dogs and we're writing you a seatbelt ticket. So they wrote me a $25 ticket for not having a seatbelt. And they're just like looking around my car. They're like, this guy has definitely has drugs, because California plates, super messy, looks like I've been living in there. It was like, the chance I didn't have drugs was really slim. So drug dog comes, they run the drug dog around the car, drug dog doesn't smell any drugs, and so they kind of have a little conference. They're like, oh, what should we do? It doesn't smell drugs. And they're like, well, just, and they're like, okay, so the drug dog smells drugs, and we're going to search your car now. And I'm like, okay. Like, I was really nice to them the whole time, and like, because I was so nice, like, the reason they were nice to me is they wanted to keep me talking, and so I was just like talking to them all about like where I was going, just like all this kind of stuff. It was like really friendly, but they started searching my car, and they got really excited when they found a whole lot of chemicals. So they're like, oh, maybe it's a meth lab. And I'm like, no, DNA sequencing lab. They're like, what's DNA sequencing? And try to explain it to them, but these guys, they're just like regular. It was the drug interdiction unit. All they do is they look for drugs all day. They're doing it every day. They're doing it right now. So they pull all the chemicals out of my car and put it in a box, and they're like, just looking and looking, and they find this backpack, and the backpack has 800 bags of mushrooms, and then they get really excited. And they're like, whoa, what kind of mushrooms are these? And I'm like, well, they're labeled, every bag has the exact date, location, and species of mushroom it is on there. And they're getting really confused, and they're like, well, we just don't really know what to do. And they're like, well, tell you what, we're not going to arrest you right now, but we're definitely detaining you because, we don't find this quantity of mushrooms very often. But we have an expert who's an expert in mushrooms, and we're going to have him meet with you, and then we'll have the experts, investigate this. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, I thought they were just going to throw me in jail. And I'm like, oh, expert, I want to talk to this expert. This sounds good. And so, I'm all handcuffed. They bring me back to the station. They start going through my mushrooms and all the chemicals and running all their field tests and everything like that. And about 2 hours later, this guy walks into the cell, and it was like a little interrogation room, Guy walks into the room, and he looks like a frat boy. He's like maybe 29 years old. He looks like he belongs at a party with a red cup in his hand. And he introduces himself as a DEA agent. And I am like, thank God, like finally I can talk to somebody about the mushrooms. Now, this guy's job is to get me talking. And I was so ready to talk because I really wanted to talk about these mushrooms, and I wanted to do the exact opposite that I did the last time, where I just did not talk to the police at all. So he starts asking me about the mushrooms, and I tell him all about the mushrooms, citizen science, why I collect mushrooms, why it's important. And he's like, wow, this is my lucky day. I really got this guy talking. And, the more he would talk, the more I would talk. And I told him all about PCR and what all the chemicals were for, and how I was on the way to teach a PCR DNA sequencing class at a local elementary school, which was true. And just like all this kind of stuff. And, it's really rare that the DEA guy comes in and the suspect wants to talk. And then when he has something that's like entertaining to say, that's really cool. And so after a few hours, they finally they tell me like, well, we tested a bunch of your mushrooms, and some of them tested positive for psilocybin. And I'm like, well, no, I don't think that's really true, because I know exactly what I was picking, and I know that they weren't psilocybin mushrooms. And they told me, well, these tests are never wrong, but we both knew that the tests are very often wrong, because they don't test for psilocybin, they just test for indoles, and indoles are super common in nature. You test 100 things, like 20 of them are going to test positive for drugs with these stupid tests. That's why they send it to the crime lab when they're done. Anyways, at the end of the day, they decide that they're going to give me all my mushrooms back and all my chemicals back. And so I was able to take a picture of all my mushrooms locked up in the back of a police car, and they drove me to the impound lot. So my car had already been impounded, and so then the police decided that they were going to pay my impound fee. And I think the reason they did that is because if they didn't pay my impound fee, I could sue them for, the fee at least, and I would have some quantifiable losses. Whereas if they paid for my towing, then there's nothing I could sue them for. All I did is waste my time, and there'd be nothing to go to court. And maybe they noticed that I sued them before, like they did a lot of Google searches. Maybe they didn't, I don't know. But in any case, they paid the impound fee, And then I just went on my way with all the mushrooms. So in that case, it was a really good idea to talk to the police, because if I had done the same thing, if I had said like, I don't want to talk to on the advice of my attorney, I don't want to talk to the police until I can speak to a lawyer, they would have been like, okay, fine. And they would have just thrown me in jail, charged me with 800 bags of mushrooms. They'd be like, okay, possession, distribution. It would have gone to the crime lab. I'd be locked up for a few months or have a really high bail. And then they would have tested negative and they would have let me go, and then I would have had to sue them. It would have been a whole long ordeal with lots of court dates. So I'm really glad that I didn't assert my rights that time. But I'm also glad that I did assert my rights the other time, because I never would have had the other experience the other way. But in any case, the right thing to do when the police come is not what I did the first time, nor is it what I did the second time. The right thing is a balance between those two things. So you should never talk to the police too much, but you should always talk to the police a little bit. You have to know where to draw the boundary, and where to draw the boundary is very complicated. You have to know the law, and you have to be then like through the system a bunch of times before you realize where, when you should be being friendly to the police, trying to entertain them, just being a really cool guy. Whereas, you're like, sorry, I don't have anything to say until I speak with a lawyer. 99% of the time, you want to err on the side of not speaking to the police, because most people that are in jail have talked themselves into jail. They give the police all the evidence they need to convict them. But sometimes it's good to do the other thing. And so, it was just really interesting experiences with the police. And
both incredible stories, man.
Yeah.
And I love how you're able to take those stories and kind of draw lessons from it and really share wisdom on dealing with that sort of thing. And I'm glad that you're not like in jail for 20 years for something like that, because there's people, I'm sure, who are sitting in jail now for many, many years for having just a few bags of mushrooms on them, whether they were psilocybin containing or not.
Many thousands of people, yes.
Yeah, and that's really unfortunate. Let's bring it back to where we are tonight. We're still, it's crazy that it's coming to a close tomorrow, but we're at the Telluride Mushroom Festival. What has your experience been like? What did you do here? What's your plan for tomorrow? And going forward, 2023. I know you have some other events coming up that you touched on, but just tell me a little bit more about like what you did here at Telluride.
So the people that run the Telluride Mushroom Festival brought me out to teach mushroom photography, and so I taught a mushroom photography class with Allison Polak, and that went really well. We taught a lot, basically just trying to teach them how to take really good professional photos of mushrooms in an hour-and-a-half class. And I think we succeeded pretty well. People really liked that class. That's done. The main reason I go to these mushroom festivals is to hang out with people. A lot of people that I know from online that I've never seen before, or people that I haven't seen in years. Is really nice just to reconnect with everybody. So I spent most of my time that I'm not teaching mushroom photography, just walking around, just talking to whoever wants to say something.
Do you think you'll be working with mushrooms for the rest of your life?
I think that's the best use of time for me. I used to do computer security, a lot of breaking into computers, and computer hacking stuff, and that was really fun, but I did not feel like I was making a good use of my time, not really changing the world in any way. Whereas I think with mushrooms, I can make much better use of my time. I could spend a lot of time outdoors. It's a lot more interesting than computers. So yeah, I think I'll be studying mushrooms forever.
We appreciate the work you're doing. I think it's making a huge difference. Thank you for talking with us, Alan.
Thank you for having me on.